Welcome, welcome to summer. This isn't it great? We finally have some good weather. I hear nods, see nods in the back, so I assume you can hear me when I'm speaking. Our speaker tonight is Eric Speth, master of the Godspeed. Captain Speth is the Director of Maritime Operations at the Jamestown Settlement Museum. He holds a U.S. Coast Guard master's license for 1,600-ton ocean auxiliary sail vessels. Has valuable experience and positions aboard several sailing vessels, including captain on the Charlotte Ann, a restored 19th century schooner, chief carpenter for the restoration of the 1877 era Elissa, a 200-foot iron bark, and chief mate on the Pride of Baltimore, a 137-foot replica topsail schooner representing the state of Maryland as a goodwill ambassador. Captain Speth has been responsible for many projects at Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. He served as a project manager for the construction of Susan Constant in the early 1990s, Godspeed in 2006, and Discovery in 2007. And he'll explain to you those are the three ships that are presently operating at Jamestown Foundation. He managed the replacement of Jamestown Settlement's waterfront facility, the ship channel dredging that was necessary to get the ships in and out of Virginia's mud, and major ship repair and maintenance projects. He planned and managed all the sailing operations for the 2006 Godspeed sail to 6 East Coast cities and several since 2006, I'm quite sure. Captain Speth serves as the master of, as I said, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery. We've invited him here this week. He spent the last 2 days talking with our crew, helping us learn about this ship, generally becoming a good friend to us. I'm delighted, Eric, to invite you, to welcome you, bring you in, and please an applause for Eric Speth. You have a microphone.
Thank you very much.
I think you have a microphone.
I do, yes. I do, yes, yes. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And as I was meeting many of your crew and supporters, it made me think back to 2005 when your group was planning to build Virginia. And so for me, it's so satisfying to look out the door and see it afloat here. And what a beautiful ship it is, and a very successful ship. In 2005, I was up here, 2004, 5, 6, and 7, while we were building the new replicas of the Godspeed and the Discovery. Godspeed was built at Rockport Marine. Discovery was built close by at Booth Bay Harbor Shipyard. So I came through Bath many times, and I did a program for your group on the construction at the time of the Godspeed. And we finished Godspeed, and as Jim mentioned, we have used the ship since then for many different types of programs. So tonight I'm going to talk with you about the process that we followed to design, the research, the design, the construction of the Godspeed. And that same process is something that we similarly used for the construction of the Susan Constant in the early 1990s. So I work at Jamestown Settlement Museum, which is managed by the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. The Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation is a state agency of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So we receive some state funds to operate our museum. Roughly half of our funding comes from the state of Virginia. The other half of our funding comes from revenue from our ticket sales at our gate, and also from donors that provide funding to our private nonprofit that funds programs, ship operation, and all of our museum operations. So with that, I'm going to begin talking about the process of researching and how we moved into that process. So our project goals with all three of the ships was to conduct thorough research, design, construction that would allow us to operate the ships just like Virginia will, and then to operate the ships in a way that we can carry passengers for hire at the dock as an attraction vessel, and then carry passengers for hire underway only on the Godspeed, not on the other two ships. So with the research side of this, we looked at all of the previous research from the former versions of the ships that were built. And I should say that the ships were initially built in 1957 for the 300th anniversary of the, or 350th anniversary of the founding of Virginia. And at that point, the museum Jamestown Festival Park was opened. And during that year, that commemorative year, more than 1 million people came to the museum to see the ships, the other exhibits that were there, the indoor and outdoor exhibits. And in 1957, think about it, there weren't interstates like we have today. So for 1 million people to get to Jamestown to see the exhibits, the organizers said, let's just keep it open. So it was only to be a one-year festival, but they kept it open, and we're still there today, now known as Jamestown Settlement Museum. And again, our organization, Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, operates Jamestown Settlement and the Yorktown Victory Center at Yorktown, Virginia. So we looked back to the research from the 1950s. We looked at the current research that was available, and we've learned so much more since the 1950s. So if you were to look at the designs from the 1950s versions to the 2000s versions, there are significant differences, perhaps like there would have been if Virginia was designed 50 years ago. We've learned much more from underwater archaeology. We've learned more from available documentation. So some of the research that we used came from the early 17th century. There were documents that we found from shipbuilding from around 1610, rigging from around 1610, surviving documents that guided us in how to design a ship from the early 17th century, much like I'm sure you did when the new Virginia was designed. So hull design in the 17th century was not like today, where a ship would have been completely designed ahead of time, like Virginia, like Godspeed, like Susan Constant and Discovery. The process then was more an art than a science. And the way that we design ships today really wasn't finalized until later in the 17th century. So as the art part of this, and let me see if I can get the pointer to work. So the art part of this is the length of the keel, the depth of the hull, and the beam of the hull were the major factors that were used to determine the amount of cargo that a ship could carry. The old English tonnage rule was length of keel, beam, depth. You multiply those three together, divide by 100, and it gives you the rough amount of cargo that the vessel could carry. So we reverse engineered the way that Godspeed would have been designed in the 17th century. If any one of you were a ship owner and you came to me as a shipbuilder and you said, build me a 120-ton ship, I, as the shipbuilder, would apply these formulas, these rules. I would come up with the rough size of the ship, of the length of the keel and the beam and the depth, and I would build the ship for you. So today, we, from our research, believe that the Godspeed was somewhere in the mid 40-ton range. So in reverse engineering, we worked the numbers of the length of the keel, the beam, and the depth, and we came up with the parameters for the size of the Godspeed. The other method that was used to determine the shape of the hull, this is the midship section of the hull. And if you look at this, there's a flat to the keel, and I was talking with David earlier about the design of the Virginia. There's a flat to the keel. These are all arcs of circles that create the shape of the center section of the hull. And that center section of the hull gives its shape to the rest of the sections of the hull. And the other thing that they did when they were designing ships is they felt they should look like the way a fish looks. So they gave them a wider head and a narrow tail. And if you look at the design of the hulls, they had that fish's head and fish's tail shape. We also learned from nautical archaeology what we could learn about the way ships were built in the early 17th century, and we applied that to the design as well. So this shows what we were able to derive from the records from the early 17th century about the way ships were designed. We applied that. We applied the rigging information that we were able to find from the documents that were available, from the illustrations that were available. And fortunately, there's a fair amount of artwork, like you see here, that shows the way ships like these were rigged. So we believe that what we've created today with all three of the ships is the most accurate versions that we can based on the information that we have available. And our researcher dug through records in England, dug through records domestically, and again, looked at the research that was done previously to come up with the current version of the ships. We hired Tri-Coastal Marine that specializes in designing historic recreated ships. And they worked with us on designing the new Godspeed. And as just a comparison, the former version of the Godspeed is here. And you can see its sizes, 52 feet on deck, the new Godspeed here, length on deck 65 feet. And where that comes from is, again, that reverse engineering process. We believed we were in the mid 40-ton range. When we apply the Old English tonnage rule to the former design of the Godspeed, it was undersized, somewhere in the 30-ish ton range. So now we believe we have what is the size vessel that sailed across the Atlantic in 1607 with a group of colonists and established the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown. So following along in the design process, Tri-Coastal Marine then designed the ship for us. We initiated a contract with Rockport Marine just down the coast, down east, I guess I should say, from here, at a cost of $2.3 million to build the new Godspeed for us. And they built the ship according to the plans that was developed by Tri-Coastal Marine. And these are some of the ship's plans. And as you look at the body plan of the hull, the sections of the hull, you can see some similarities to what I showed you earlier from the research, with the flat on the bottom of the hull, the arcs of circles, and the flats above the waterline. So this is a very typical shape for an early 17th century ship, just like the Virginia outside the door here. And then we went further to develop designs for the inboard profile, the inboard arrangements for the vessel, how it would be laid out, framing plan, decking plans, midship section, how the construction details would be put together, things like these beautiful knees that I saw on the Virginia today. And when I was on board and down below, the vessel has such a great feeling to it. It's very robust, it's very strong, it's very well built. And I'm very impressed by what the crew did here in building the Virginia. And as we look further, deck framing and how that was put together, and very similar to the way Virginia is built. And then to the construction of the ship. So every ship starts like this, with laying the keel. And I was talking with David and some of the other staff today earlier about the early construction of the Virginia, and we share a similarity in that we have a lead shoe, a weighted piece on the bottom of the keel to increase the stability of the vessel. Because as David and I were talking about earlier today, in the 17th century, Godspeed would carry about 40-ish tons of cargo. That cargo would be in the cargo hold, the belly of the ship. Today, some of our cargo stands on deck and moves around as passengers. So we needed to ensure that the vessel would be stable with some of our cargo on the deck, just like you've done in the way Virginia's been built and designed. So laying the keel, we laid the keel here on Godspeed, and a little dim, but there is a weighted shoe on the bottom of the keel here. And then once the keel is laid, then the construction begins from there. So as you saw outside the doors here with Virginia being built, the stern post and transom are erected. These are from the design and very typical of the shape of a 17th century transom. The angle of the stern post came directly out of our research. So the angle that the post is attached to the keel. As we move to the framing of the vessel, the frame is a double sawn frame construction. So one piece overlapping over another. In the early 17th century, very likely it was a single sawn overlapping frame structure. But this is the frame structure that we today, and especially the Coast Guard and the regulatory bodies, are much more comfortable with, to have a vessel that would be built with double sawn construction. So we used double sawn framing, and you can see the frames going together here, fabricated on the framing floor, various pieces that were awaiting their turn to be fastened together. The frames were bedded in between each piece to ensure that this ship would have the longest life possible. So we chose materials to build this new Godspeed that were not the materials that were used in the 17th century. We used, instead of domestic hardwoods to England, we used hardwoods that were from the tropics. So all tropical hardwoods that are very durable, very strong, very available in the quantities that we needed to build the ship. So we used, for the framework, Angelique, the keel is Angelique, the planking is Angelique below the waterline. Above the waterline, the planking is Wana. The deck is silver bali, all very hard, very durable materials. But we followed good shipbuilding practices, bedded materials, prime materials. We fastened the frames together with trunnels or tree nails. I think Virginia's done the same way. So the frames are all fastened together in a traditional way that the frames might have been done if they were single sawn and fastened together. And as you see here, this is, we talked earlier about the belly of the whale, and you look at this and you can see the frame sections coming together, one in front of the other. They would be put together on the framing stage and then picked up and put in place. Framing stage moved forward so another frame could be built, and so on. And then as the framing progressed, then the shipwrights built the stem section of the hull. And here you can see the knees and the framing behind the stem piece being fastened together with bronze drifts. We use bronze material for all of the fastenings below the waterline and above the waterline to give the ship, again, longevity. Bronze in our environment, in the Virginia environment, is far more corrosion resistant than galvanized steel or our boat spikes. And then the stem installed here. And again, the radius of the stem, the shape of the stem, came directly out of our research. So we modeled that to ensure that the ship had that 17th century shape to it. And then once the stem was in place, the stern post was in place, we then built the half frames that joined the keel on either side, joined the stem on either side, and you can see those going in here. The half frames in the bow area, and the half frames and the hawse timbers and cant frames around the bow. And that's bow framing complete. And then moved back to the stern framing, the aft hull framing. And these also would be half frames that then would be joined on the framing and around the keel and the transom. And here you can see the knee pieces going in around between the transom timber and the keel. And then the rabbet was lined off and pockets were cut for the remainder of the half frames. And then those half frames were installed. And then the framing was complete. So once the framing was complete, and now from construction, which started in December of 2004, we're probably spring of 2005 and getting ready to plank in the summer. Longitudinals were put in place. Those are the parts of the structure that hold all of the frames in place fore and aft. So the longitudinals went in. The keelson is an inner keel, a keel that is in the inside above the keel and above the frames. And then the other longitudinals, the bilge stringers, these long pieces that span from fore to aft. And then the deck clamps, which would lock in the frames and also have a place for the deck beams to rest on, were installed. These were all steamed and bent into place by the shipwrights there at Rockport. They were all fastened into place with fastenings that were similar to those that would have been used in the 17th century. So we used clench rings, basically a big heavy washer with a big heavy bolt or drift. They would have done these out of wrought iron in the 17th century. Again, we used all bronze to ensure the longevity of the ship. And here's one of the shipwrights driving one of those drift bolts into the hull through one of the longitudinals, the deck clamp. Once the deck clamps were in, then the ship was ready for its deck beams, and the deck beams support the upper and lower decks. And here's a shipwright shaping one of the deck beams and then installing the deck beams. And then once the deck beam structure went in, then the carlins, the fore and aft pieces were placed to provide space for things like hatches and other fore and aft sections of the main deck and the quarter deck. And then these beautiful knees, Hackmatack knees, which came from Maine, were shaped and they were then fastened into the hull. This is the master shipbuilder, John England, who's working on one of the knees. And the knees then were placed into the hull. This would be one of the lodging knees, which is a horizontal knee. And then the other knees were hanging knees. So here's the lodging knee in place, and here's a hanging knee. The function of the knees is to create resistance from wrecking of a ship in a seaway, to prevent the ship from tearing itself apart as it works its way across the ocean and through waves. So these significantly strengthen the hull, and there are some beautiful knees on Virginia that I saw today and really appreciated how they were shaped and how well that they were fit on the Virginia. And then breast hook to tie the two sides of the bow together. The breast hook is a heavy timber that can be shaped either out of solid wood. In this case, it was out of pieces of wood versus using a hackmatack knee or another grown timber to create the breast hook. And then from there, the shipwrights started the process of lining off the hull for the planking. So the process of lining off is, unlike the side of a building, which can have individual clapboards that are all the same shape, all the same width, to line the hull off, because a hull, like Virginia's or Godspeed's, is different widths from the keel to the top of the rail. So the shipwrights divide up the space from the keel to the rail at certain points along the way from fore to aft, and then they can divide those sections up into the widths of the planks. So they know how wide the plank will be at certain points along the hull. And that's what they're doing here. So they're just measuring and placing those marks on the hull so they know how wide the planks will be in certain places. And then each individual plank was spiled, and the spiling process is to place a wooden flexible batten on the hull, transfer the marks that the shipwrights placed on the frames to this batten from the plank that's in place to the batten, thereby creating the shape that can be reproduced by removing the batten to a piece of planking stock, transferring those marks to the planking stock, connecting the dots that they've created from the hull to the spline, and then cut the plank out in the shape that will fit that space. So once they've splined a plank, then they shape the plank into an individual piece that's like no other plank. And then each plank was steamed for an hour per inch of thickness, and the planks are about 2 inches thick. So each plank was in the steam box for about 2 hours. When the plank comes out of the steam box, it is magic. that you can take a piece of wood that would not yield in any way to any pressure, and it can be placed around the hull and bent in by the shipwrights with a little bit of effort, but it can be bent into the shape of the hull. This plank is a good example that at this end, it's vertical. And at that end, as it goes forward, where it's under the flat of the hull, it's almost a 90-degree turn as it moves forward. And again, it's magic to see this happen. And it has to happen in a very short period of time, because once the plank cools down, it can no longer be bent. So the process continued, spiling, shaping, steaming, and fastening. The hull planks are fastened with bronze screws instead of trunnels, which would have been traditional in the 17th century. We use bronze screws, and fortunately now that allows us, when we have to do our dry dock inspection for fastenings, we're able to just withdraw a screw and give it to the Coast Guard for inspection. They keep it as part of our record, and then we put a new screw in place. And what we're finding is, as we remove these screws, now Godspeed is 16 years old or 17 years old. At the last cycle 2 years ago, the screws that came out were still shiny like the day they went in. So we're glad that we used bronze, and I know that you've used some bronze as well, and that gives the ship a major advantage for longevity. So once the planks were all in place, then we caulked Godspeed in a very traditional manner, as Virginia was caulked and many other wooden boats are caulked with cotton and oakum, and below the waterline is paid with an oil-based putty. Above the waterline, we used a modern caulking product. But the same process as would have been used in the 17th century. Once the hull planking was complete, then we moved on to some of the deck structure. And here the decking is going in. Things like the bits are being installed. The hatch combings are being installed. Things like the windlass was fabricated and getting ready to be installed. Bits I mentioned, the windlass bits are here and being installed, and being fit very carefully and locked into the hull, because the windlass bits have to take a significant amount of strain from the anchor. And when the anchor is pulling during a gale on the windlass and the bits, we want to make sure that they're locked in very securely into the ship's hull. Then other items were finished, like masting and rigging. Here are the example of a mast step, a solid, large, heavy piece of wood that the mast locks into, the base of the mast locks into it. And yes, we did put coins in each one of the mast steps when we put the mast in, to give the ship good luck and all who sail on her. So for Godspeed, we found a 1607 coin, and we believe it was built in probably 1605. So we have a 1605, a 1607, and we have a modern main quarter under the mizzen mast. I think that was the year the quarter came out as well. The main quarter came out when we were building Godspeed. So we have that from Maine traveling everywhere with us. Other masting and rigging products that were installed: dead eyes, sails, all the various parts of the rigging. And Jim was involved in rigging. Where are you? You were involved in rigging Godspeed.
Nelson.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so electrical, mechanical. So Godspeed is set up with 2 diesel engines, a generator, hot water heater, battery banks, and storage in its engine room. So this is looking into the engine room, and there is a doorway in the lower deck that we have. We can open it up, and when you open it, there's the magic of the engine room in there. And I would say that Rockport Marine and our naval architects did a really nice job trying to fit all of this into the space that would have been the bread room in the 17th century, where they would have stored foodstuffs for the crew and the passengers during the voyage. So this is the bread room, and now an engine room. And then things like modern electronics, you can see here, are hidden behind doors. So this door closes. There's a navigation table here that is removable. So when we're sailing Godspeed, we are able to open up panels, include and install various elements. And we have two modes of operation for Godspeed. One is its primary function, which is museum mode, when it's at Jamestown Settlement, open to the public. And then we have navigation mode when the ship is underway. And when it's in navigation mode, engine room is accessible, electronics are accessible, navigation is accessible. We also have built in down below cruise quarters and cruise accommodation, which I'll get to as well. But as we were finishing the ship, painting and decoration, and I really like the distinctive decoration on the Virginia. Our decoration came out of the historic record. So I looked at quite a number of prints from the period, and I came up with a composite for the Godspeed of what it might have looked like, because we have no idea what decoration it had. We had no idea what color it was, but looking at surviving prints and illustrations from the period, I was able to come up with this paint scheme for the Godspeed. And so it's very typical of early 17th century. Interior arrangements were being completed. And I'll point out here, as you look down the hatch that goes into the aft cabin, you'll see some modern looking things here. So these aluminum handrails make the statement to the public when they come on board, I'm not supposed to be here. And we have people that look at that and they get that message. That's not supposed to be here. And we have these non-skid aluminum grit treads that are not supposed to be there, but they sure do prevent a lot of slip and falls. And people see that and they make that connection. So we've done that throughout the ship. Whenever there's an area that a visitor or crew member would traverse through and needs to have a safety handrail, it's not something that, because they wouldn't have had them in the 17th century, we use something that makes that statement. Other interior arrangements, these are typical 17th century cruise accommodations. So this is the type of berth that we believe the crew would have lived in. There's a set on the starboard side down in the aft cabin, another set on the port side just like this. And then in the aft cabin for the master's cabin, there's a single berth. There might have been two, but there's a single small berth in there as well. And then as we go down below into the cargo hold section of the ship, I'll just back up a moment. This walkway that goes from the aft cabin, this railing goes down into the cargo hold. So when you go into the cargo hold, you come out here, and immediately across from it, we have a table, we have a ship's galley, and the ship's galley is set up in such a way that when we're in museum mode, these wooden panels are placed across all of these openings, and it completely closes up the galley, and it creates a space that looks like the rest of the wooden paneling in that part of the ship, and it just camouflages itself and blends into the interior portion of the ship. As you walk forward through the cargo hold, there's another opening just like that with a removable wood panel that allows the crew only, and we don't allow visitors or passengers to use this, but there is a marine bathroom ahead forward in what is the forecastle or forecastle portion of the ship. So there's a marine head, and then opposite the marine head in the forecastle is a modern shower facility, so that when we sail Godspeed, and we sail sometimes for weeks at a time. In 2006 and 7, we were sailing for months at a time. So it was very convenient and comfortable to have this facility for the crew. We also build in, when we're in navigation mode, these modular berth sections. So we have these bunks that can be built into the cargo hold. We have 2 sets of 4, so we can accommodate 8 crew in berths that are temporary, modular, build them in, take them out when we get back into museum mode. And then we have the 5 berths that are aft. And we believe Godspeed had 13 crew in 1607, and that's the number that we sail with today. And as Godspeed was finished up, ready for launch, this is about 14 months into the process. Godspeed was built in a building at Rockport Marine, and there was 3 inches to spare on either side. And John England says, yes, I measured it before we even signed the contract. So he knew he wouldn't have to tear the building apart to get us out. And it was like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon the day it came out. This was March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, and it was a happy St. Patrick's in Rockport and Camden that night as the boat came out. And then the next day on the 18th, we launched Godspeed, 18th of March, 2006. Pretty large crowd, about 1,000 people there when we did the launch. And John England's daughter, who was born in Virginia, was the one to break the bottle across the stem and launch the ship. Successfully launched. We did a quick spin around the harbor, and then we finished Godspeed, installed all the rig, completed all the details. We did the sea trials here in Penobscot Bay, and then myself and my crew delivered Godspeed down to Jamestown. We commissioned the vessel there at Jamestown, and then we embarked from there on a promotional sail along the East Coast to promote the 400th anniversary of the founding of Virginia in 2007. So this is 2006. So we traveled to 6 cities along the coast, about 3 months in and out of cities. We had Godspeed on all sorts of docks that we created. In all, about 500,000 people came to that experience in those 6 cities. And we exposed this message to millions more in the cities that we visited. So it was a very successful for us. And then in 2007, we did something that hadn't been done in 50 years. In 1957, the 3 ships sailed for the 350th anniversary. And in 2007, we sailed all 3 ships. And I had other friends of mine, captain friends of mine, that came and helped sail the other 2 ships. So we sailed all 3 several days over 2 different periods. And it was very successful for us. We sailed Godspeed around the entire state of Virginia and opened it to every dock that we could get to across the state. Today, what do we do with Godspeed? How do we use it? And how did it transition from that 2006, 2007 promotional vessel to what we do today? So we have a volunteer sailing and maintenance program, much like you have here today. And our volunteers are very active. They give anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 hours per year collectively. And we have more than 40 active volunteers in our program. And our volunteers, like yours, I could see, participate in training. They participate in outreach sailing when we sail to another port. They conduct ship maintenance, and they also serve as historical interpreters. So Jeannie here in the foreground is part of our sailing and maintenance volunteer crew, and she's working with a couple students who are learning how to sail a ship in the 17th century. Carol in the background, who is one of our paid professional interpreters at Jamestown Settlement, sailed with us on this voyage. She also serves as a volunteer. So we have some of our paid staff who love doing this so much that they also serve as volunteers. And again, our volunteers that we have give so freely of their time, 8,000 to 10,000 hours a year. And we can't do what we do without our volunteers. And I guess it's probably the same here. And so thanks to volunteers in Virginia, and thanks to all the volunteers here and what you do and what you've done for Virginia. So what we do with Godspeed is, as I mentioned, it has 2 modes of operation. Primarily, it's open to the public at Jamestown Settlement. We see about 350, 400,000 people a year at Jamestown Settlement. And when we sail to other ports, we carry with us our educational message. So we're a goodwill ambassador for the museum, for the state of Virginia. All 3 of our ships are considered to be Virginia's founding fleet by a proclamation of our General Assembly. And so we're the official fleet of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And when we sail a ship to a port, for example, last year, we were shut down for 2 years for COVID. So last year we started our program back up again, and we went to Norfolk for Harbor Fest, a big regional tall ship festival. We were in Chestertown, Maryland, where the Sultana is. I've heard some of you have talking about the Sultana. We went to their downrigging weekend event festival, which allowed us to carry passengers on board, to open the ship to the public. And then we were in Urbana, Virginia, where we also conducted education programs for students. This year, we were last week, just got back from Norfolk for Harbor Fest. This summer, we're doing a Teacher Institute sale where we'll have teachers who are doing an in-service training come to Jamestown and Yorktown, our sister museum, for in-service training. And part of that is sail on the Godspeed and learn what it was like to be a sailor, to learn what it was like to be part of the officer corps, and to learn things like navigation, life on board, what it was like to be on a ship sailing across the Atlantic. And then later in the year, we'll go to 2 other events where when we're there, we'll do special event activities. We'll open to the public, and we'll see in both of these smaller counties, Lancaster County and Onancock, we'll see every 4th grader in the county on the Godspeed in their county so that they don't need to travel to us at Jamestown for that same program. Not that we don't want them to do that, but we provide that also free of charge because our private nonprofit, our Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation Incorporated, provides all of the funding for sailing the ship. So the state of Virginia provides no funding other than the 3 paid staff, the cost of our salaries, to be on board when the ship sails. So when we do outreach education in a port, when we sail from Jamestown to another port, we do things like sail setting, like I mentioned earlier. We'll teach students how to set sail and what it was like to be a sailor on board in the 17th century. And then one of our voyages, we partnered with the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, and a scientist from VIMS put water quality testing instruments on board, and we tested water quality from the James River to the head of the bay and back. And it was an incredible record for VIMS to have that amount of water quality information that they could use in their database. During our voyage from Jamestown to Baltimore, the scientist was sending this data back, and they were crunching numbers and creating exhibits. And we got there, and the staff from VIMS brought these great visuals that we were using to teach students about water quality, ecology, the importance of the bay, and the importance of respecting the environment. And the students were very, very interested in that. And so you can see here, Dick is teaching about the ecology. And in the background, Doug is teaching another group about setting sail and life on board. And then we also do public programs when we're in port. So here you can see Kelly is working with a young man who came with his parents, and she's teaching him about navigation, how to sail across the Atlantic and know where you are and get to where you want to go. And much before GPS and other forms of navigation. And then Godspeed is open to the public, and you can see the crowds here on the dock just waiting to get on board. And then finally, ship's maintenance. The other very important part of this is our volunteers provide a great deal of effort and time providing ship's maintenance. They do everything from rigging and maintenance of rigging, painting, wood repairs, building and repairing navigation instruments, and all of that's essential to our program. And again, without our volunteers, we cannot do what we do. So thank you, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Like to award you a Maine's first ship hat. This happens in mine, but you'll get a clean one later on. All right, so there you go.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, the hat.
Okay, good.
He's got it.
Thank you.
And yes, any questions? No. Yes, the lady in the back.
During the construction up here in Maine, do you have anyone from your organization supervising, coordinating, collaborating, or did you just leave them to it and trust that everything was going fine?
Well, I personally would have completely trusted Rockport Marine to just sign the check and give us a boat. But to answer your question seriously, and I failed to say that in the beginning, part of my duties and responsibilities over the years is I've been involved in the research, the design, and the construction of all three of the ships, and have personally managed the construction on behalf of the museum. So I was the on-site representative and worked very closely with Rockport Marine. And I was here and with Booth Bay Harbor Shipyard when they built Discovery. So I personally was here sometimes several weeks out of the month working with each one of those shipyards. And at one point, we had 2 ships under construction at the same time here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Eric, how did you get state to invest in the program?
Sure. How did we get the state to invest in the program? Back in 1952, the Jamestown Commission was created to study and determine how the state of Virginia should commemorate the 350th anniversary. The Jamestown Commission became the Jamestown Foundation, and that was how Jamestown Festival Park was created and opened in 1957 to commemorate the founding of Virginia. As the years went by and we as a country commemorated the 200th anniversary of the founding of America in 1976, at Yorktown, the state of Virginia built a similar facility to Jamestown, and now we're known as the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, and we operate museums at 2 locations, at both locations. So the state invested in the 1950s in the development of Jamestown Festival Park, now known as Jamestown Settlement, and the state of Virginia provides roughly half of the required funding to operate those 2 museums. The remainder of our funding comes from the gate and from our fundraising from our private nonprofit.
There's one question there in the back.
Do you have any examples of, or can you, or what possibilities there might be for having an exchange program between some of your volunteers and our volunteers to experience the activities and operations of each of our programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question about how we can promote and discuss an exchange program between the crews of our vessels. And that's something that I personally have been promoting for decades. So I have worked with the Elizabeth II in Manteo, North Carolina, the Maryland Dove, the Mayflower, and other 17th century ships. So last fall, for example, when we sailed Godspeed to Chestertown and Urbana, we had crew from the Mayflower with us on all of those legs. And that way we can promote a crew exchange and exchange of ideas and training between our ships. And I would be happy to have that conversation with you and your group as well, and how we can do that.
Yes.
Yeah, it seemed what I took from your talk is that the design of Godspeed was based on the fact that she was 40 tons. So I'm wondering what kind of documentary evidence you had to believe that 40 tons rather than.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. So this question is the evidence that we have that supports the size of the ship that we built, the tonnage of the ship that we built. So in the 17th century, ships were designed to carry a certain amount of cargo, and we believe that Godspeed was at the time in the 17th century somewhere in the mid 40-ton range. And where that comes from is John Smith wrote about the 3 ships, and John Smith said that Discovery was 20 tons and Godspeed was 40 tons. Susan Constant was 100 tons. We know that he was wrong on Susan Constant, and we know that because Susan Constant was involved in a minor collision in the Thames immediately before sailing for Virginia. So there was a High Court of Admiralty case where sailors, officers came and they were deposed to take their side of the story. And of course, they had to also say what size was the ship, what tonnage was the ship, because that's how ships were defined and described in that period. So in that case, they said Susan Constant was a 120-ton ship. So John Smith was not quite right. So we're not sure that he was right on Godspeed or Discovery. We also, through our research in England and domestically with all available sources, original documents, there are documents that support a Godspeed, and Godspeed could have been spelled several different ways, like discovery, discoverer, discoveries, Goodspeed, Godspeed. So where I'm going with that is we think the best guess is somewhere in the mid, maybe upper high 40-ton range. So this new Godspeed actually measures out, according to the tonnage rule, at about 47 tons.
Norman?
What happened, do you know what happened to the ship historically? Did they sink there in that area? Or?
Yeah, so what happened to the three ships, I'll say, Susan Constant and Godspeed, were chartered by the company, the Virginia company, from the owners to use just for this voyage. And they came to Virginia. They basically were passenger ships. They carried the passengers here, got them here safely, and then they collected materials that were representative of what could be economically harvested from Virginia for a profit. Because one of the goals of the Virginia company was to make a profit for the investors, just like companies today. And so they collected a variety of products that were brought back on Susan Constant and on Godspeed. They returned to England. We believe Susan Constant continued its career for maybe another 10 years, and then it was lost from the records and probably sunk, wrecked, or something like that. Godspeed, same thing. It sailed, it was in the records for a number of years. There were also more ships with that name. So we kind of lost track of it as well. So we really don't know. Discovery was purchased by the company. So basically, I like to say it was the company truck. And they used it among all around the colony, trading with the indigenous people, which was extremely important at the time for their survival. And they used it for things like fishing. There are documents and records of Discovery, which is very similar to Virginia, sailing out in the Atlantic fishing. And that also helped the colony survive.
Yes, David.
These ships, what year did these ships come?
1607. So departed England December 1606.
So that was before the flotilla, including the Sea Venture?
Yes, the Venture was 1609. And that was a resupply voyage to Jamestown. And they wrecked on Bermuda. The vessel that was built after they wrecked, they built a vessel out of the bones of what survived, and the Deliverance and the Patience were built out of the bones and sailed to Jamestown.
What record, if any, do you have of Deliverance being at Jamestown, and did she operate on the Chesapeake, or what happened to her? And anything that you have in terms of the Virginia?
Yeah, so Deliverance and Patience were built to deliver the survivors from Bermuda to Jamestown. And then after that, I am not sure what happened to them. They probably sailed on in their careers, but I don't know what happened to them after that. And same thing for Virginia. It's my understanding that Virginia sailed and came to Jamestown and then might have also done other trips back and forth across the Atlantic. So quite an able and worthy ship, just like the one outside the door.
Rob? Go ahead.
Excuse me. Have you published any of your research on how to design and build these boats?
We, the researcher that we hired to do the research for the Susan Constant, Brian Lavery, published a book, Susan Constant, Merchantman 1607. So that's been published. The material that we have for the Godspeed and Discovery is in our library at Jamestown Settlement and has not been published. My work on the research and the concept designs that I drew for both of them, Godspeed and Discovery, are part of that research.
Question, let me go first here. Yes.
Are you the only institutional memory that they have down there for all of this stuff?
Yeah, so institutional
You are.
memory of the ships. Yes, I have a very long tenure with the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. So yes, I maintain the institutional knowledge and memory of it.
Stay healthy.
Take your place.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.
Question?
You have a person to take your place?
That is being discussed at the appropriate time, yes.
I have a sort of a
Are you
follow-up
interested?
question, with regard to that, I wonder if you could comment on the differences in construction techniques and resources, therefore the results of Godspeed built in 1607 in Plymouth compared to Virginia built in a remote colony off the coast of the Gulf of Maine.
Yeah, so question is differences, similarities between the Godspeed built in, we think maybe 1602, 1605 timeframe, and it probably was built just outside London. Like Bath was a shipbuilding mecca. There was an area like that around London as well, that everything was just right for building ships. Compare that to building a ship in a frontier environment like the Virginia was here at the Popham Colony. I guess my understanding is, and I'm not sure that I would be the expert on this, but my understanding is that the Virginia was built by a shipwright Digby, who was a apparently very experienced shipwright and had a great deal of knowledge of how to build a ship like this. As far as did they have parts and pieces that they brought with them that were pre-built, we know, and I can't comment on that, but we know from the Jamestown voyage that when they arrived in the mouth of the Chesapeake, part of what one of their other goals was to explore the Chesapeake and look for a way to the Northwest Passage. So they came to Virginia and the Chesapeake knowing that they needed to have small boats, they needed to have a boat like Discovery that could be maneuverable and shallower, that could travel up these rivers and look for the Northwest Passage. So we know from that voyage, from the Virginia voyage, that they had a probably prefabricated shallop in the cargo hold of Susan Constant. In how many pieces, I'm not sure. The research is not really clear on that, but there was some prefabrication clearly that they could quickly build this boat and have it ready within days or a week to be able to start exploring. So some here probably have a better answer than I do.